When looking for the king of podcasts, you're at the wrong channel.
Well, excuse me!
Looking for good ideas for life? You're far from good hands.
Hey, bud, what's your problem?
If you think the listener is always right, you're far from the right place.
Out of order! Even in the future, nothing works!
Hosted by a Northeasterner by birth, but a rebel by choice.
Are you threatening me?
If you want a host that floats between love and madness,
and we know the night is always gonna be here anyway. Thinking of you's working up my appetite, looking forward to a little afternoon delight.
then play on and listen to Crazy Train Radio.
All right, guys, listen to this blues riff and B. Watch me for the changes and try and keep up, okay?
Within the gaming world, there are your general gamers, but then there are those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming. If you're one of those that enjoy the dark underbelly of gaming, we certainly got the place to send you. Scorpion Lair Games. That's right, Scorpion Lair Games is the creators of the true crime hit Killers, the card game. Let's not forget they also have Killers Clothing Company, their profiler game, and things like the 5-Minute Murder channel on YouTube. And we certainly can't forget the new book that is certainly a hit, Beyond the Headliners, True Crimes, Myths, and Legends. Make sure you visit Jeff and the Scorpion Lair Games on Facebook and everywhere today.
Hey everyone, I'm George Schire. I want you to know I do a lot of podcasts. I love doing podcasts. And I've got a new one that I love doing, and I want you to listen to it. Crazy Train Radio. Another one of the best. You'll enjoy.
Hey folks, it's your least favorite host in the podcast world, Croc, Jonathan Steele. And boy, do we have a good one for you today.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, children of all ages, we are going to go round number 4 because we have 3 Broadways with this gentleman who is a lifelong wrestling fan, historian, author, many things, and that being George Schire.
I thought you were talking about somebody else.
No, well, no, I say mean things about the other person, but there's going to be a little curveball here with this, folks, and that being there's going to be a 3-way.
Hey now.
Sort of. And that is because we have the author of The Wrestler's Wrestler and historian, and just maybe for some odd reason he's my friend, which we told that story. But Mr. Brian Young is here.
You're crazy. I know you are, but what am I?
Brian, how are you?
I am good, but I would be remiss if I did not correct you and say co-author with the legendary, the great, and one of the greatest human beings on the face of the earth, Dan Murphy.
Okay, terrific.
So got to give the shout out to Dan as my co-author on The Wrestler's Wrestler. But I am so thrilled to be here for this, and I don't want to call it a three-way. That seems like a little sketchy for my taste.
I plead the fifth.
Yeah, me too.
I would like to call it a handicap match.
Okay.
How's that?
Right on. So, Mr. Young, as you go through some chords and empty the desk out there,
Yep.
I had asked you this afternoon, or whatever it was, about what, if there was anything you wanted to bring up. And you said to me two words, and that was free flow.
Yep.
So, obviously, I have, as I was hinting at with the introduction, 6+ hours of content, just one-on-one conversations with George, hence the Broadway remark. Why don't you throw something out there for us to begin with?
I will.
I say
and I
one
want-
thing before we go farther.
Yes, sir.
Brian Young, you mentioned that you're the co-author with Dan Murphy. And I just want it known that we are all aware that Dan Murphy is going to get into the Cauliflower Alley Club. This year, he's going in with the James C. Melby Historian Award. And I think that's noteworthy. And it's definitely long overdue. And it's definitely well deserved.
Indeed. He is so deserving of this. And I just love the fact that your names will be linked together now as a former winner of said award.
Well, yeah, that's very true. 2013, I was given the Melby Award. And I shared with Brian, I shared with you and with Dan previously that I do take great pride, not only, of course, getting the award myself, which I never intended, but certainly I am honored by that. But I shared with you that I was more honored that I was able to be the one that was responsible for that award ever coming to be in existence. After my friend, personal friend I tell you, forever, since we were teenagers together back in the late 60s, Jim Melby. And when he passed away in February of 2007, it's hard to believe that it's been that long ago already. The man was only 57 years old when he passed. And when I went to Cauliflower that year in April 2007, I was on the board of directors at the time, the executive board, in fact. And I say executive because I was there with guys like on the board, like guys like Dick Beyer and Nick Bockwinkel and Red Bastien and Penny Banner and Killer Kowalski, et cetera, et cetera. And I made the motion, a suggestion that we do something to honor the historians of the business that through the years had done so much work to keep wrestling's very complex, very sometimes out of whack history in order. And and we earn the title historian. You know, I pointed this out. I never call myself a historian, but obviously through time, I and so many others like Dan and so many others have been given that honor. And Brian, you too. You know, you've done your share of research and work. But initially with Melby, just to not to belabor this a long time, I just find it so important that Dan gets this, that he's finally getting it. I had suggested to the board that we have such an award. And the board voted, I can tell you, unanimously, with Red Bastien being the one to stand up and say, and I can quote him, he said, I think it's long overdue that we honor the scribes, as he called us, and that and it passed. And the following year, in 2008, I was given the prestigious honor of naming the first ever Historian Award winner, Jim Melby Award. And I chose Scott Teal, who
Well deserved.
which is without a doubt, in my opinion. And when I did this, I had in the back of my mind, if I'm going to be in charge of this, would Jim be proud of this choice? Would Jim be okay with this choice? And Scott Teal was the first one. For many consecutive years after that, I was on the board to make a nomination along with the other nominees or the other award winners at the time. And when I stepped off the board, I was off about a year, and I got a call from Jason Sanderson at the time, who was on the board of directors. And he said, "We voted you," meaning me, "to be the next recipient." So I guess it all worked out not the way I thought it would be, but I was honored. And I know for the past 8 years or so, I have been on the nominating committee as it was. I think it's changed this year. But the nominating committee, and Dan's name was on that list every year. And I can tell you with my hand on a Bible, he got my vote. And when I found out this year that he's getting it, I said, finally. So Dan, if you're gonna listen to this and you're gonna hear this, I just want you to know that I am super happy for you, and it's just long overdue. And congratulations, and keep up the work. And all of us that are historians, we have to continue to keep that pre-1984 going backwards. We have to keep it out there for the new fans, the younger fans, and for any of those old guys like me that still want to know what happened, how things worked in the old days. So amen to that. Back to you guys.
Well,
Very, very well said.
Absolutely. But I do have a quick question, because I think it's only fair to tell the story as much as we can. You mentioned you were friends with Jim for so many years, from the 60s until his passing. So for those who don't or didn't know Jim, who was he, and how would you describe Jim for those folks?
Well, I think the best way to describe that is, I had mentioned a moment ago that Jim and we met as teenagers. I was 17, he was 19. This was in 1968 when we became friends. I lived in Cottage Grove, Minnesota. It's a suburb of St. Paul. Jim lived in St. Paul. We had never met. But ironically, it was big in the later 60s and through the 70s that we never, back in those days, guys, we never had internet. We never had access to what matches in other cities and what was going on in other territories. But through fan clubs, a lot of the wrestlers back in that era had a fan club for themselves that some fan took upon themselves to chronicle their career and follow them and present a bulletin periodically, and fans would join those fan clubs. There were also some, back in the day, they were crude in their publishing nature. We didn't have all the sophistication we do today to publish things very professionally and that look really great. But there was a magazine called Matt Mania. It was done by a guy named Burt Ray. And Burt Ray had this magazine for a while. Burt Ray was also a younger guy at the time. I have to admit, I never met Burt, but Melby did. And Burt had put out this magazine. I attended the matches on a somewhat regular basis at that point, because I had gotten my driver's license about a year before, and that set the tone for have wrestling card will travel. Once I had my own license, I didn't have to rely on my dad or anybody else to get me to a card. And I had subscribed to Matt Mania. Long story short here. And, anytime I tell a story, that's foolish because they're never short. But I had subscribed to Matt Mania. And I'm going to tell you, it for the time period was a really state-of-the-art magazine. It covered wrestling from other territories. Burt was really good. Burt Ray was really good at having a territory close-up and talking about the Gulf Coast and Florida and Texas and California, etc. And so when I saw this magazine, I said, God, this is awesome. And I subscribed. I waited a couple of months and I never got an issue. And finally, one day in my mailbox, I get this, looked like it was printed on a office school printer, if you remember those, how crude they were in their printing style. And it had a staple at the top of it. And it was called Wrestling Results by Jim Melby. I had no idea what this was. I opened it up, and there comes the apology letter that if you were expecting to get Matt Mania, that Burt Ray had given the thing up and he had subscribers. Jim had decided that he would take on the subscription and go forward with this. And it was basically just wrestling results from around the territories. Well, naturally, I was a little upset. This was not what I had. And this magazine format was a nicely printed magazine for the time period. Matt Mania was. And so lo and behold, Jim Melby is in there and his address is listed as St. Paul, Minnesota. And I looked him up in our kids. There was a thing back then called a phone book. I looked him up and I got his address. I didn't call him. I wrote him a letter, and I will tell you, I wish I had a copy of the letter because I wasn't very nice in it. I basically insulted the product that I'd received. I was upset that I wasn't getting my Matt Mania, and I sent off the letter. And about a week and a half went by. My phone rang one night. I had a phone in my bedroom in those days, and I answered. Is George there? This is George. George, my name is Jim Melby. And the silence I just gave you is what I did when I heard his voice, and I had a lump in my. I had no idea how old this guy was. I had nothing about him. I said, okay, hi. He says, well, I got your letter. And he introduced himself to me. He said, I live in St. Paul, of course. And he said, I notice you live close. We've been to the auditoriums together. If you go to all the matches, I said, yeah, I go regularly. We were running sometimes 2 times a week, AWA back in those days, but at least once a week at that point. And Jim and I talked for about, I think it was about an hour and a half that first night. We became friends, and we decided we were going to get together. We were going to meet. And about a month later, I had ended up in the hospital with a little issue I had. And the prize of surprises, Jim Melby and his wife at the time, Brenda, came into the hospital room, and I had never met him. And he introduced himself again, and I'm sitting on the hospital bed, in my hospital gown. And he brought a couple back issues of Matt Mania, and we agreed we were going to get together. And the rest of that is history, because Jim and I got together. We not only began going to all of the St. Paul, Minneapolis wrestling cards. Jim taught me the most important thing. I never understood results at that time when he was doing this wrestling results bulletin, but it was results from all over the territories. And he taught me how important they are. And when you say the importance of Jim Melby, Jim was very high on obtaining results from St. Louis or whatever city and have regular chronicled. He used index cards in those days, and like the little recipe boxes that you'd put cards in. And I got the bug, and I started along with him. We would go to the libraries regularly and go through old newspapers in different cities. We'd look up wrestling results from wrestling cards. And the more I did it, the more I wanted to do wrestlers' results records. And now I say to folks today, what's important about a results record in a sport that was predetermined? But I tell you what, the results tell a story of a wrestler's career. You see when they started out in the business, how they probably lost all the time. They were They were learning the business. They were other guys, were beating them. Then you see how they go to a territory and they're moved up in the cards. All of a sudden, you see that they're main eventing, and in this city they're a heel. In this other territory, they're a baby face. They're wrestling the next night against a tag team partner they had the night before in a different city. I mean, results are just phenomenal. It shows the titles they had. It gives all the various names and aliases that they use. In this territory, he was so-and-so, and in this one, he's now this guy. And so they became just a lifeblood for me. And so what does Jim Melby mean to the business? He taught me. And to this very moment, I sit here. I do research practically every single day. I'm researching some results on a wrestler or wrestlers in general. I personally have compiled a lot of, we call them life results records, but I'm going to let you in on a secret. They're never totally complete, because just when you think you have every result of every wrestling match, you come across 3 matches in some city and you go, holy crap. Then you have to verify them. And that gets you back to the, research of old newspapers or whatever it is. So that's what he meant. And Jim was heavy on that historian stuff. It was important for him to keep history alive, to tell wrestlers stories. And so he put out wrestling results for, I don't know, maybe a year and a half or so. And eventually, most of the people weren't renewing to it. A lot of the fans that had subscribed to Matt Mania, they didn't understand, or it wasn't their cup of tea. But Jim was working at the time alongside with Norman Kietzer, who was the publisher of the Wrestling News magazine at the time. And Pro Wrestling Enterprises was his name. Excuse me. So Jim and I, at each of the wrestling cards in the Twin Cities, we would take the magazines to be sold at the particular cards that evening. And we would also then be in charge of getting them back to Norm Kietzer. We traveled a lot together, Jim and I, to different cities for wrestling cards, to not only spot shows, but we'd drive to Kansas City or go to Omaha, whatever it was. And Norman joined us a lot of the times, gave me a chance to write articles for Norman's magazine, as well as Jim, of course, was an editor for the magazine at the time. And so that's really how I got started, and it all came from Jim Melby. But the fact that he was so strong on wrestling history, I think that's the answer to your question, that when he passed, there were so many of us, whether it be Scott Teal or Tom Burke or any other name you can throw out there of the historians that have been given the Melby Award, and so many that haven't yet. They all owe a bow to Jim Melby, because in a way he taught us all the importance of wrestling history. And I have become a stickler that I want wrestlers' names spelled correctly. I want them, when they're in a territory and they wrestled as Dr. X, I want them listed as Dr. X. I don't want them listed as Dick Beyer or Jim Osborne or whoever the Dr. X was. It's just important to have it all right, and to have the different names that they used. So all the wrestlers through the decades that I have had the honor to get to know personally, and they've been my friends, they accredit guys like Melby and myself and the Scott Teals and Tom Burks and so many others, that history of old wrestling is important. I hope that answers your question. Who is Jim Melby? And let me just point this out. Yeah. When he was 21 years old, so 2 years after I met him, Jim found out he had diabetes. And he had moved to New York to work with Norman Kietzer when they were publishing. They took over Champion Sports when they were doing Wrestling Review magazine. And they started Wrestling Monthly magazine as well while they were out in New York. While Jim was out there, he got very sick. He was in the hospital, damn near died. And he had lost about over 100 pounds with this diabetes thing. He struggled with it for the rest of his life. And towards the end, the last 4 or 5 years, I told you he passed at 57. For the last the last decade was the toughest on him, but near the end, he had pretty much lost all of his eyesight. He had lost a leg, lost toes on both feet at different times due to the diabetes. And eventually he lost the second leg before he passed. And I got the news in February of 07. I got a call that he had passed. And that was a blow. Him and I went to baseball games together through the years, major league games. We went to movies back in the day. We went to concerts, a lot of old concerts. We had a lot in common. We used to sit up and eat White Castle hamburgers and trade wrestling photos, 8x10 glossies. I'll trade you my Rock Rogowski for your Rene Goulet, that type of thing, while we're golfing down. If you know what White Castle hamburgers are, they're a love them or hate them hamburger. But Jim and I, we did. We had a good relationship, a good friendship. And so the James C. Melby Historian Award at Cauliflower Alley Club is now almost 19 years old. And we've had, I think there's only 1 or 2 years that they didn't give out the award. Might be 2 or 3. But there's at least 15 or 16 well-deserved historians. And again, that's where it's important now that I can say that my friend Dan Murphy is going to be among us and with us because it's deserved.
Absolutely. And I don't think people realize about the historian aspect of it. When you and Jim were doing this, kids, there was no internet. You couldn't go on libraries.com and pull up newspapers from libraries all over the world. You couldn't find any of this stuff at your fingertips. You were going to libraries, going through probably actual newspapers or microfiche, if people remember that too.
Oh, yeah. Old microfiche, yeah.
And there was a lot of work that went into this. And this wasn't just make you rich. You did not get rich off being a wrestling historian. Nobody does. This was a labor of love. This was a passion. And this is something that I don't think too many modern fans of the business realize that if it weren't for people like you and Jim and folks like Jim Cornette and Scott Teal.
Yeah,
and
Cornette
all that,
too, yes, yeah.
No one would know this because the people in charge of it didn't care about the history, so to speak, because, their shows would air, tapes would get taped over right away. If you missed it, it was gone.
Yeah.
It was all about making money at live events, keeping the business going, but what happened year to year, month to month with the person didn't really matter as much to the offices as far as record keeping. So it's the people like you that preserved this that we have today. And it's amazing. The books you did on Minnesota wrestling results in history is just incredible. I mean, it's not only a reference book, but it's just so much fun for people like, who are interested in history and in the business. And we all tip our hats to you because it's a lot of stuff would be lost to history if it weren't for people like you and Jim.
Brian, I also want to say to you, the promoters, the wrestling business and the promoters, by their very nature, they didn't keep history or want history. They didn't want fans to remember what happened a month ago if they didn't want them to remember.
Yeah, exactly.
The only time a wrestling office wanted you to remember something is if it pertained to a current program between two wrestlers or two tag teams. Then it was important, and they would make sure you remembered it. But if something happened a year ago, a wrestler was in and out of the territory, they didn't want you to remember that. It was all about right now. And the thing that was important was, I'm going to quote something that I probably said on one of our Broadways here, and I think it kind of ties in. Nick Bockwinkel said to me while he was visiting my room that you see me sitting in here, he said to me, if it wasn't for guys like you, we wouldn't know half of the stuff about our past. He said, because it was a job for us. We went to work every night. And I put that into perspective because for my working life, all the years I worked, I went to a bank. I worked in a bank. Every morning you go to the bank, you do your job, you come home. Do you remember everything that happened? Do you have everything chronicled? Do you remember, everything? No. And Nick says to me, it was the old story where we drove to a town, we wrestled, we hoped we got paid by the promoter. And he said this. He said, we hoped we got paid. And then we'd go to the hotel, and he included, we'd grab some bread and bologna for sandwiches and some beer, and we'd go back to the hotel. The next morning, we'd get in our car. And, the guys, they'd travel 3, 4, 5, 6 guys in a car in those days to share gas expenses. And then he says, we drive to the next town where we do this same thing over again. It's kind of like the Herman's Hermits song where the second verse, same as the first, in Henry VIII. And Nick said this to me. He said, and when he's in my room and he sees a picture or he sees a program or he sees a magazine that I have, and he says, I never saved any of this stuff. He says, even if I was on the cover or I was in the magazine, I didn't save it. He said, and we wish we did. And thankfully, there are guys like you directing it to me at the point. And he said, without that, none of this stuff would be out there. Yeah. And I took that as the greatest compliment. But it also tells us that we are the people that keep their lives, their careers straight. And when a guy like Nick Bockwinkel would call me, and he did often, he'd call and we'd just chat. But sometimes he'd call and he'd ask a question. And it would be a question about his career. He'd say, well, what year was I in? Did I wrestle there? He'd ask me if he wrestled somewhere. I said, yeah, as a matter of fact, you did. And I'd rattle off what it was. And you learn that they appreciated us. And when Nick was on the board of Cauliflower in 2007, he was also there as one of my advocates to say, let's honor not only Jim Melby's memory at this point, because Jim, of course, never got the award that was eventually named after him. But in my opinion, there was no better person to name that award after. And so if in Cauliflower, it's the James C. Melby Historian Award. And then the George Tragos Luthez Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa, they also have a James Melby award that they give out now. And it's just a great honor to a guy that he was the guy that started it for all of us. And I'd just be remiss if I didn't say, man, I was blessed, truly blessed to know him personally and to have his friendship right up till the end.
And it's amazing about the history and legacy of the business because we're in an era where, primarily it's one corporation that runs the entire business. And even them, with their Hall of Fame and their museums, they rewrote the history so that if it didn't happen there, it didn't happen.
Right.
Or even if it did happen there, but before they wanted it to. The people don't exist in there that were part of their own company because they rewrote the history. Right. That it's all about them. And that's what's really disturbing to me, that they're the ones with the power. They have the museums, they have their own Hall of Fame, and then they ignore history unless it's theirs.
Yeah.
That's disturbing.
And Brian, what's important about the historical side of things is that, at least from my era, I think today it's a lot more in the open. If you look at the WWF, WWE in the past 40 years now, because it's 40 years, well, it's 42 years for God's sakes when Vince McMahon started his national expansion. That was in 1984. So, yep. But if you look at the way they've run their business, they recycle a lot of their wrestlers. They'll bring some guy in under some gimmick, and if it doesn't work for him, they put him on the shelf for 2 months, come back, and he's somebody different, and they give him a different name and a different gimmick, and everybody's in the know. Oh, well, that's so-and-so. Well, that's this guy, you know. Back in our era, or in my era, you know, people don't realize that in November of 1970, a guy who had worked for the AWA for about a year and a half before this, who was getting some training. He wasn't trained by Vern Gagne, but he was getting some training from Vern and some of his wrestlers. And this guy, I'll tell you his name in a minute. He's in the AWA for about a year and a half, kind of a mid-card guy on the cards. And in November of that year, he goes to Japan for one of the big tournaments the Japanese promotions always had over there with the companies, the wrestling companies. He goes over there and is teamed in a tournament over there with Larry Pretty Boy Hennig. And they're in Japan. Well, the guy's name was Bob Windham. Big Bob Windham. Now, what's interesting is that after that November tour in Japan, Bob Windham never came back to the AWA. Larry Hennig did. Bob Windham never came back. In fact, while Hennig and Windham were over there, they won the IWA Tag Team Championship for a short time, like a lot of the American wrestlers would do at the time. But Hennig came home, Windham didn't. And the beginning of January 1971, debuting in the WWF, and it's on the cover. I've got the program on one of their magazines. There is the new creation, the latest, greatest, biggest thing, Black Jack Mulligan. And that, folks, is Bob Windham. Now, in that era, that day, unless you were an insider or a person like myself and the other historians that saved programs from all the territories, that got programs from all the territories, you would have never known this, and Bob Windham's name would have faded off into the sunset, and you'd have never known. And so that's why it's so fun to do these results, because immediately now, Bob Windham's dead from a wrestling perspective. And he was never Bob Windham again. Now, in later years, in the 80s, yes, it came out. It was more open, like you say, with your internets and, you know, and that sort of thing. But those are just like one example of how cool it was to be involved in that era. And when you look at the history part, if I was doing a Bob Windham results record, well, if I didn't know he had went on to become Jack Mulligan, he stopped wrestling in 1971 or 1970. That's what I'd have. So it's fun to know that now going forward, when I do the research on his results, that starting in January, and I make notes in my records, that Bob started wrestling as Blackjack Mulligan from this point on.
And what's interesting is how the business kept that up where they wouldn't bring the guy back under a different name, right? You know, at least right away. You go a decade later from Bob Mulligan to Blackjack Mulligan, Bob Windham to Blackjack Mulligan. Decade later, Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, all of a sudden there's this tall, lanky blonde named Blackjack Mulligan Jr.
Yeah.
He never came back there as Barry Windham, but he was Blackjack Mulligan Jr. there.
Yeah.
Until he got his feet under him.
Yeah. Well, and see, it's interesting, too, because I've mentioned results records. And again, this comes from the blessings of Jim Melby back in the day. If you were to go to the room right behind me here, which you see me sitting in, I have literally hundreds of results records in binders of wrestler results records. And what's always important to me is, like I'd mentioned a moment ago, that if he wrestled as Bob Windham in this territory, that's how I list his results. if he wrestled in this next territory under a different name, that I note that now he's so and so, and it really chronicles a history very nicely. I have a wrestling results friend, and he is a good. I'm not going to mention his name, and if he knows this, he'll know I meant who I'm referring to, but he does it a little bit differently than I do. He will chronicle some records, and he'll just list the guy under one name through the entire career. And I will say to him, you can't have Lars Anderson wrestling in a St. Paul match in 1965 because Lars Anderson was not created yet. He didn't exist. It was Larry Heineme in those matches. And he says, well, it doesn't make a difference. It's just, he just put the guys, just do his results record. It does. I said, you're really missing the point. That's part of what the history part is. That in 1967, Larry Heineme disappeared. And all of a sudden, in the Southern ranks, we've got this new brother tag team, Gene and Lars Anderson. And again, unless you were savvy to some inside stuff, I didn't know that at the time in 1967 until I started getting some programs. I used to get traded programs with Gene Gordon, who was a photographer for the Carolinas and Atlanta wrestling. And Gene used to send me their programs, and I'd send them ours in a copy of ours in exchange. Actual programs. We never made copies. I'd buy extra programs, send them out to my friends, and they'd send me theirs. So I knew Lars Anderson, or Larry Heineme was now Lars Anderson. But until stuff like that happened, whatever happened to Larry Heineme? I don't know. And, we can go on and say, well, we had Alan Rogowski. Vern trained him, brought him into the business. And for a year and a half or 2 years almost, he was Rock Rogowski. Mm-hmm. Well, all of a sudden, Rock Rogowski's gone. And lo and behold, here is this new dude that's a brother down to the Andersons, Ole Anderson. So if you don't put the results in the name they're using, it just, to me, it's almost destroys the efforts you're trying to do their wrestling records.
Well, it also destroys the history, like you said, because, a lot of times a name change in a territory would move you from enhancement talent to mid-card guy to a headliner. Or the reverse. I mean, you can look, if you want to go more modern times, you can look about, Terry Taylor's top of the business until he goes to the WWF as the Red Rooster. Are you going to keep the same records for them without noting that here's where they destroyed him?
You bring up a good point there, because a lot of times, Brian, and I mean, what you said is exactly true. There were times when some wrestlers would go to a territory and they just were not given that mega push that they'd received somewhere else, or, they just didn't get over well. One of the things, and I had a talk actually with this subject to Red Bastien one time. And Red told me, he said, because he was always interested in the fact that I did these results. And Red said, the thing is a lot of times when we went to a territory, it was all about getting paid. Again, it goes back to that. It's a job.
Yeah.
It's their job. And he said, if we were making good money, putting other guys over on a mid card in every, he said, what was the issue? And if you go somewhere else and you're making good money and you're not in the headliner every week, there it is. So it wasn't always, I mean, and let's clarify something too. In the old days, there was a distinct line of jobbers, enhancement talent, whatever you want to refer them. They called themselves jobbers. A lot of the modern fans take offense at that. And a lot of the old wrestlers, they said, that was it. That was our job. We were jobbers to put someone else over. But there were guys that were just lifelong jobbers. And that was it. Sometimes it was by choice. Sometimes it was that's all they worked wrestling part-time, or they were just satisfied just making a few bucks on the sideline. Then there are guys that would go to a territory, and for whatever reason, they maybe weren't the solid main eventer they were in the previous territory, but they're still making good money, and they're being used as to how the promotion felt they were best to be used at the time. And it worked out. And, when you look at all of the guys, man, we had 4,000 wrestlers back in the day that were traveling all over the country, Japan, Australia, Germany, New Zealand, Hawaii, you name it. They were traveling all the time to all these territories. So.
And it is business. It's about money, and that's what it should be to the performer. I mean, it's an art form, and it is art, and it is something we can be very passionate about, but it's their jobs. I'll never forget, I was talking to Jim Duggan when I was working on the book, and I was asking him all these questions about the run in the Mid-South when it was at its absolute peak, 1983, 84 into 85, when Mid-South was drawing bigger than WWF was or anything. And, it was Ted DiBiase, it was Jim Duggan. Then you had the Midnight Express come in with the Rock and Roll Express and the Russians, and it was just so huge.
Junkyard Dog.
JYD setting records all over the South, yeah. And I'm talking to him about that, and I'm like, what was your absolute proudest, time where all this great work you did? And he says, 1989 WWF, because I made so much more money. He's like, I was a cartoon and it was a gimmick, but oh God, I made a lot more money.
I always think it would be interesting when you mentioned Terry Taylor. A lot of people say that Vince destroyed him as a wrestler, and it was a cartoon and it was goofy. I have never heard Terry Taylor touch on this, but I think it would be interesting to see, did he really, really feel that this was making him a buffoon and he didn't advance by it, or was he getting paid well and he didn't care? And I think he probably did pretty good financially.
I think he did. He got a big push at the time, if everybody remembers.
Yeah.
He was getting TV slots every week. He was getting house shows, which means he was getting a push. I just think it was an example of, sometimes Vince would come up with ideas and gimmicks that just didn't work. He thought they did. He thought they would, but they just didn't work. And I think that was an example. Poor Terry Taylor, because he had all the talent in the world, but, once you're the Red Rooster, it's kind of tough to come back from that.
Look at, I know I don't usually talk WWF or WWE, but take a look at Stone Cold Steve Austin. McMahon brought him in originally as, wasn't it the Ringmaster, or what was his goofy name? It was some goofy gimmick he had, and it just died on the vine. It was terrible. And Vince, again, he repackaged him. Eventually, this Stone Cold character shows up. But you know what's interesting when you use Steve Austin as an example is if you go to when he was in the WCW, or it wasn't WCW, it was still NWA, I think.
Still NWA at that point,
when he was stunning Steve Austin with Brian Pillman, they were the Hollywood Blondes.
With his bleach blonde hair, yeah.
Yeah. And the thing about that is that even though that was a good gimmick for Steve Austin at the time, I don't think the NWA knew what to do with him. They just didn't come up with the right niche. And McMahon put him into Stone Cold character, the kind of in-your-face anti-hero, tell the boss off and have the fans cheer you, which was a good gimmick because how many of us in our working careers would you like to have went into the boss's office and told him, why don't you just take this and go to hell, But we can't do it because you won't have a job. And that's what made Steve Austin such an interesting character, because he related to the people. He was somebody that they wanted to be, or he did stuff that they wished they could do. Give the boss the finger. I mean, it was so good.
and give him the credit for this because, look, I am not a fan of the entire Attitude Era. I know that was
me either.
That was the biggest draw, and that's when I think you really killed the business that I loved. But nobody could have done that character like Austin did. And as a historian, I will look back at that era and it'll be Steve Austin. Because he transcended it. He transcended the Attitude Era by having the attitude. But it's because it was a performer in the right place at the right time where I don't think there was another guy in that business that could have played that role the way he did.
You know what's interesting when you say that is that now if we go back to the territorial era before the WWF invasion, what was interesting about the territories, and we mentioned a minute ago how a wrestler could go from one territory to another and have a different role, be a different level on the card. A lot of it had to do, and let's just give credit where credit is due here. In the northeast part of the country, the WWF area, there was no guy for 11 years from 1963 to 1971, just a little shy of 8 years, that could have been the rock of that promotion better than Bruno Sammartino.
Exactly.
But it was an ethnic thing. Bruno was popular with the Italian base, population base, and the same as Pedro Morales was with the Puerto Rican population. But you take a guy like Bruno and you bring him into Minneapolis, and he's just another guy on the card.
Well, and that's the thing. It's not only styles that are so drastically different by regions, but like you said, it's got to be the right guy at the right place. There's stories about when they brought Bruno into Houston into the 70s, and they had to apologize to the people afterwards. Yeah, we're sorry about that. Because Northeast wanted big, strong men, lumbering, slow, the matches were slow.
Yeah.
Vern wanted realism. Vern wanted wrestlers that looked like they were actually wrestling.
Yeah.
Bruno goes to Detroit with the Sheik, which, the fucking madhouse that was Detroit at the time. He doesn't go over there either. They're like, what the hell is this? Is boring. Houston, where they were yawning during Bruno. But in New York, to this day, you will meet, senior citizens that will say, wrestling stuff, that's all garbage, but Bruno was real.
Right. Well, look at it this way. We know how big, on the East Coast, Pedro Morales was at least Vince McMahon Sr. I always call him Daddy Bush, or Daddy Bush. I always call him Daddy Vince. Daddy Bush was the president.
Yeah.
I always call him Daddy Vince. He used Pedro Morales as the heir apparent to Bruno after Bruno wanted to take the time off for a bit. And after Pedro was done with his WWF reign at the time, Vern Gagne brought him into the AWA. Now, I'm here to tell you that Vern gave him a push. Vern acknowledged, which they didn't often do in other territories. He acknowledged to us, the fans, that Pedro Morales is the former WWF champion. He had him in a huge program that was a main event against the Super Destroyer at the time, masked. It was Don Jardine under a mask for Vern. He had him in a program against the Super Destroyer and Angelo Mosca, who was Super Destroyer's partner. He also had him in, he even gave him title shots against Nick Bockwinkel, Pedro Morales. But let me tell you, the fans did not respond overwhelmingly to Pedro Morales in the AWA. He was a wrestler. He wasn't anybody special. When he got introduced, it was, sure, he got claps from the fans, but it wasn't that he's the greatest hero in the business. He didn't get over. The same thing happened with Bob Backlund. When Vern brought Bob Backlund in, Bob was a good draw on the East Coast in how they used him. And keep in mind that he also had killer heels to always draw well for him.
Exactly.
That's part of that whole equation. Because Bob, well, this is a personal opinion. I thought Bob Backlund was boring in the ring. But he had monster heels that could work with him, and he worked with them, and it made Bob Backlund great out there. But when he was here, you introduce Bob Backlund and people go, who? Huh? Oh yeah, him. That's really what it was.
But Bob's a weird case because I think if Bob would have worked with Vern from the get-go and was with Vern before he was with the South or WWF, it would have worked because he was a legitimate shooter. And Vern would have turned him into something, I can't say better than what he became, because he was the friggin' WWF champion, the highest paid guy in the business for several years.
5 years.
But he was about as exciting as watching paint dry.
Exactly.
You know, when the WWF champion's finishing move is an atomic drop, you know, and really what you got of him was he would fight these monster heels that beat the shit out of him, and he would somehow miraculously come back because he was an All-American boy. I mean, that was the whole gimmick.
Yeah.
Doesn't work everywhere. I think Vern could have made him into something special.
But you know, the thing is, too, about, let's just take the role of a champion here. And I think Backlund was good at doing this in his WWF reign, in that he played the role where the fans, you go to see the champion. I always felt, and this was an NWA territory or promotional criteria, the champion always had to appear to be able to be beaten. That the opponent had him, they had him, and somehow he snuck through, which builds a rematch. If in Backlund's case, and I'm going to give you a little backstory here that I don't think a lot of people know. I mean, it's not secret or anything. I think part of Vern's problem with Backlund was it was Eddie Sharkey that trained Bob Backlund. Eddie Sharkey and Vern Gagne at that time period were not buddy-buddy. They had a falling out several years earlier, and they were not on good terms. So Vern wasn't excited about doing something, whether it's childish in his thinking or whatever. I don't think he was going to ever take to Bob Backlund, even because of his amateur and his actual wrestling ability style, that he would have if Vern would have had trained him, like Vern did 150 guys in the business over the years. But I think that's what the deal was with Backlund.
You know, I'd like to ask you this, and I'm sorry, Jonathan, we're like completely ignoring you. See what happens?
Go ahead, ask your question.
You put us together, and this happens. I never had the pleasure of meeting Vern Gagne. I've spoken to Greg, but never met or spoke to Vern. I always got the impression, and I know you knew Vern, and I know you love Vern in your way, that Vern was maybe a little too hard-headed for his own good, maybe held too much of a grudge for his own good. Am I reading that wrong, or was that really the real Vern, that he might have been too hard-headed for his own good?
Well, I think the best way to answer your question is, I'm not going to disagree with you that Vern could be hard-headed, could be stubborn, could be he was more often than not a my way or the highway type guy.
Mm-hmm.
But what you have to do, Brian, is you have to look at a guy like Vern, who in the 60s, when he formed the AWA, in the 60s through the 70s, right up to about 85, when things really started to get different, just plain weird and different in the business, Vern ran, and I wish we could have guys like Bockwinkel and Bastien and Larry Hennig and all these old wrestlers that worked for Vern to answer this question. The one thing they will say always is Vern could be difficult to work for, but he was the best to work for because he paid well and he understood the business. And we were put over and we made money and most wrestlers, I can't tell you the number of times I've had a wrestler say to me, I always wanted to go to Minneapolis. Now, when they say that, they're talking the AWA. It was the Minneapolis Boxing and Wrestling Club, which was the headquarters for the AWA. And they will say, I wanted to go to Minneapolis, or I hoped I could get to Minneapolis. And when they did, generally, like it happened in those days in the 60s and 70s, a guy would come in for a year or two and then move on when their shtick gets a little old and they move on to the next territory. But most of these guys that came, and a lot of them would want to come back, a lot did. And Vern was I'm just going to give him credit that he understood how to draw money. He understood how to create a character if he had to. He liked wrestlers, but he would have a character. You know, the Crusher was a character.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, but Vern could go with that because you talk about that territory charisma. The Crusher was so over in the Midwest, Milwaukee, Minnesota, the Dakotas, Chicago, Iowa, you name it. The Crusher he was our Bruno. He was so over. He didn't need a title. Didn't need a title to get over, and he didn't want the title. The couple of times that he had it for a coffee break, it was only as a favor to build a match for Vern, a rematch, or to just make a program work. But Vern, I think another way to explain something to you is it's chronicled out there over the years, the rivalry or the feud between Vern and Larry Hennig. And it was real, Brian. Behind the scenes, I think more on Larry's part always than Vern's, but they didn't like each other. They didn't. They just, and Larry, he just couldn't let it go. He did not like Vern. But here's the thing. Larry wrestled, I'm going to say 85% of his career from day one to the end in the AWA. And Vern paid him and kept him on top the entire time. He was in main events.
Son in the business.
He started him in the business. Yes, he did.
Yeah, he started his son.
And, yes, and he also trained Kurt later on, ironically. Along with, Billy Robinson and Brad Reingans and some of those guys, they worked with Kurt. I mean,
he brought in Henning's son.
Yeah, but Vern understood that though Larry we're not close and we're going to be palsies outside the ring, I can make money with Larry. And Larry, on the other hand, as much as he would tell you, I don't like Vern Gagne, I don't like to be in the same room with Vern Gagne, they had some classic matches. And what's really interesting about that is the matches, even though they were still predetermined how things were going to turn out at the end of the match, you could still, because they didn't like each other, the matches were good. They had a chemistry. And Larry used Vern his entire career because Larry, by his own admission, did not want to do a lot of traveling to other territories. And like I say, about 15% of the time he'd be gone, but 85% of the time he was here. And Vern kept him on top. And so Vern took care of Larry. Larry took the big money. It worked. But Vern's character, Vern's biggest criticisms were later on when he brought Greg into the business. And I will tell you, I don't know if you've read the Vern Gagne book that Brian Ferguson put out.
Yes.
But when Brian and I were sitting with Greg we sat with him for several interviews at Greg's house, and we talked that Brian could get this information for the book, okay? And Greg flat out told us, he said, my dad didn't want me to come into the business. He said he begged me not to come into the business. Greg had been pretty much a football player. He put out a leg, injured his leg. Greg wanted to come into the business. And he told me, he says, when I finally decided, and he always called him Vern. Greg always called him Vern because it was a business relationship thing. So he'd always say, Vern, when he brought me in, he basically pulled me aside and he said, when you get in the ring, you'd better realize that there are going to be some guys that are going to take their liberties with you because of me. So Vern knew that they're going to, and Greg said more often than not, he said every once in a while I'd be in the ring with somebody and they'd get cute with me and they'd give me a huge slap or pop. And then he said the guy would say to me, give that to your old man. Stuff like that. But Greg said one of the things that Vern did, and looking at Greg, his stature, his build, he wasn't the biggest guy in the world, okay? But I'm going to tell you the truth. If you messed with Greg, you were probably on the heels of wanting a death wish because Greg could take care of himself. And Greg told me, and he told this to Brian Ferguson too, Vern and Billy Robinson taught me how to take care of myself in that ring in the event that my opponent wants to test me, So Vern took, and the thing that Vern was wise on, and ironically, we're talking about Vern. Let's point out that today, April 27th, as we are taping this is the sad passing of Vern Gagne back in 2015 on this day. I had made mention in a comment on Facebook that on this day I was in Disney World with my family, and I actually got a call from a lady from the New York Times, if you can believe this. And she'd heard about Vern's passing, and the New York Times was doing a story on Vern Gagne. And I talked with her for about an hour and a half on the phone in Disney World. But Vern took care of Greg. He was smart enough to never put the world title on him because he understood. And then the other thing, I'm going to just say this because I know it from my banking world. I hate it when a fan says, well, the only reason Greg ever got a push was because his old man owned the company. First, it's a stupid comment. And second, you're probably saying it out of jealousy. I worked in a bank. The owners of the bank, the owner was the CEO, his son-in-law was the president, and he had his sons in there as officers of the company. Were they there because they were the owners? Yes, but I'm here to tell you they also knew their business, and they knew how to run the business the way they wanted it to be run and the way they felt it was best to run to make money. And that's the way Vern ran the AWA. And he didn't put the title on Greg, the world title. Later at the end of the line, he created that television championship or whatever it was. But he knew that Greg was better in a tag team with Brunzell, and it worked out good. And did Greg ever give me personally? I saw every single match Greg wrestled in the Twin Cities, every one for his entire career, plus in various other cards I went to around the territory. I never saw Greg in a bad match. Never.
When?
Never saw him in a bad match. And I can also tell you this, and I pointed this out before, when a guy like Nick Bockwinkel, when you asked him, and I asked him, and other people asked him point blank, who did you enjoy working with the most? And he says, Greg Gagne. And I asked him, I said, really? He said, whenever I worked with Greg, it was like I had the whole night off because Greg was so smooth and so good to work with in the ring. That's a compliment, kids.
Well, I'll tell you right now, I have heard nothing but good things about Greg Gagne as a worker.
Greg Gagne's
himself.
great. Greg Gagne's great.
I know a lot of people, and Greg's heyday was my childhood. I watched Greg throughout the late 70s into the early 80s, and I always thought him and Brunzell were a great team.
They were.
They were dynamic. They were exciting. They both could work. They made it believable. I think Greg Gagne suffers from Larry Holmes syndrome. My favorite boxer of all time is Larry Holmes. Larry Holmes was my hero from childhood. But Larry Holmes had the misfortune of being in between Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
So where does history put Larry Holmes?
Yeah.
People who weren't there to see it say, he was garbage. It was just everything sucked at that time, waiting for the... No. Larry was, in my opinion, way better than a Prime Tyson. A Prime Holmes would have destroyed a Prime Tyson. And yeah, he beat up an old Ali, but I bet he would have given even a Prime Ali a hell of a fight because Holmes was that good. Greg Gagne is that Larry Holmes type wrestler. He's in between his father and Bockwinkel. He's got the name, so people all want to claim nepotism, but they won't actually watch what he did and give him the credit for the talent he had. To them, it's a name they just want to bash.
Jonathan put his hand up a moment ago. I think he has to go to the bathroom or something.
Actually, I wanted to at least get one question in here, if I may.
Why don't you just talk the rest of the way?
All right.
Free flow, remember?
Free flow, yes, I know. Free flow. But I'm curious because I saw somebody comment something to a wrestler from the territory system earlier today. And it got me thinking to something that I had heard long ago, and that being the separation of the person versus, and in this instance, I'll call it a character. Like Hogan lost Terry Bollea long ago because of being Hogan. Mad Dog Vachon lost Maurice Vachon long ago, if that makes sense. And the reason this conversation was happening was sadly because of Ric Flair, and he's been doing a lot of interviews and he blames it at being drunk. Then will come out and apologize later on. I shouldn't have said this. I was drunk, this, that, and the other. So I'm curious to know, was there a lot of cases where guys would lose who they really were along the way?
I'm going to answer first, George, because you're going to have a much more in-depth and better answer than me. I just want to give an anecdote first. When I was interviewing AWA legend Larry Zbyszko, WWF legend as well, people forget that. And I got along great with Zbyszko, and I still do, and we still text and send messages, and he told me that I don't get a lot of love because everyone thinks I'm a total asshole. Because my entire career, I had to be a total asshole. We had to live our gimmicks. I couldn't go out there and be a nice guy to the fans. If a kid asked me for an autograph, I had to rip it up and throw it in the air. And I think that's, in a sense, you can get lost in a character that way. But years later, Larry's come to terms and he's who he is. Someone like Flair or Hogan, I think something in their psyche broke, and Terry Bollea in his brain believed he was Hulk Hogan. He didn't live it, just live it like Zbyszko had to, but I think he believed it. It happens with rock stars. It happens with athletes. But, I think if you'd have gone to the Mad Dog Vachon's house, you could have talked to the man, not the character. I don't think you got that with Flair or Hogan anymore. What do you think?
Well, I think you nailed it pretty good about guys kind of becoming the character and overshadowing their own personality. I give you an example when you just mentioned Mad Dog, and Jonathan, you mentioned Mad Dog. Mad Dog outside the ring, for most of his heel career, he had to be that guy, like you pointed out, where he'd snarl and scare you away. And if you tried to get an autograph, he'd rip up your program or whatever. But Maurice Vachon knew that that was a character. That wasn't really him. It was a person that he played. And I got to know the Mad Dog outside the ring. A most gentle man, quiet. The snarling, growling, toothless individual you saw during his ring interviews and in his matches, this was a character. And that character never overshadowed him. To him, he was always Maurice Vachon. I think, pardon?
Gentleman Olympian.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the thing that bothers me the most, I didn't know Hulk Hogan. I can flat out tell you, I never even met Hulk Hogan. I don't know how that happened. I never met him. But Ric Flair, this is a guy who he got, I think he's mixed up even to this day on his own, he believes his own publicity.
Yep.
He believes that he's the nature boy. And he can't let go of that. He doesn't realize that at 76 years old, or whatever he is, that he's not even close to that character anymore. Why don't you come off your roost? Why don't you come off and be a human being and be polite and be kind? And we also know he's had his demons to deal with. And it's just, it's tough when you see a guy like that pretty much destroy himself. I know he had a retirement match here, I don't know, a year or so back, one of his coming out of retirement things, and he was drunk during this match. I mean, he's embarrassing himself. It just comes to the point where, you know what, you're not 35 anymore. You're not 40. You're not even 50. Admit it. You're an older guy or an old man. You move on. So,
or, some people, Ricky Morton, in his 70s, still going. But he'll be the first to admit, because, I blew all my money on cocaine. Yeah. I ain't got no retirement plan. I'm working to live.
Well, and you see,
that.
And you see, that's a sad thing too, because I know so many wrestlers, or I knew so many wrestlers, that all the money they made, and if they made $1, they spent $2. If they made $1 million, they spent $2 million. Am I supposed to feel sorry for a person like that? I mean, I feel sorry for their problem, but I don't feel sorry for them that they put themselves there, because you didn't pay attention. Yep. You thought the well was never going to run dry. You're on top of the world. And you're right, in those days, they didn't have pensions. They didn't have insurance most of the time. So it was a different business. But in the 80s, the later 80s into the 90s and the early 2000s, it was an ugly time, because how many wrestlers did we see that were dying at age 35, 40, and 45 years old? Allegedly of heart attacks or something of the nature. When the hard reality was, they were dying because they were using drugs. They overdosed on the steroid abuse. They were doing cocaine. They were doing everything to excess with no thought that I might not wake up in the morning.
Yeah.
And that's when go ahead, Brian. Sorry.
No, I want you to finish the point, because I'm going to go back a few steps after your point about character.
Okay. Well, this was going to change subject because of something George brought up about never thinking a well was going to dry. And it's an argument still to this day. I guess it's the other big thing I wanted to bring up during this episode. And there's the whole argument of guys being 1099s or independent contractors. So, and, especially with these big corporations now, TKO and everything, AEW, all that stuff. But it's been like that forever. But the difference was back in the territories, you can move around and go work for different people. Where you can't now. You're supposedly an independent contractor. So I couldn't go work Monday Night Raw next week, go work for Tony Khan on Dynamite on Wednesday, then come back and do SmackDown on Friday. Do you think this argument of being employees versus independent contractors will ever be hashed out?
No. It'll never be hashed out in this business when the money is almost obscene and controlled by a small group of people, and they have the power because they kept unions out forever. They'll never get in now, and they can all pull the my way or the highway game. The money's all there, and especially now with the billions coming in from the Saudis, given the company that much money, and the guys making that much more than they used to. And if you complain or say this is unfair, I need to be treated, they can say, okay, you can go. Where are you going to go? Like you said, where are you going to go?
I think,
so I don't, yeah, it's never going to solve.
I think a good argument for let's go back to the territorial system where the wrestlers were legitimately independent contractors as they referred to themselves. Yeah. And really what that meant for the common definition is a wrestler would agree to go work for a promoter or a territory for a period of time. And Vern Gagne said this best. It was always, we worked with a handshake. We didn't have contracts. I bring this up again. I worked at a bank. I didn't have a contract that I signed that I'm going to work there. It was a mutual agreement. We hired you. You come to work. Here's your job. Here's your hours. Here's your pay. Yep. If I don't like it or I have a problem, I can discuss it with them, or I can decide I'm going to go to another bank or do something different. I'm independent. That worked for me. And that's what these wrestlers did. And Nick Bockwinkel, again, I use him because Nick was so wise. In hindsight, I see it more and more. He said, after I'd been in the AWA for a couple of years, and Nick came here made his debut in December of 70. So for the first 5 years, he was involved in the tag team title situation with Ray Stevens. He'd had some matches with Vern, but it was eventually decided that he was going to get the title from Vern. He was going to take Vern's title, and Vern was going to just take more of a backseat business-wise. And Vern was, 50 years old at the time. And let's remind people that Nick was 41 when he won the AWA title. He had been in the business for, since 1954. So here it is, 1975. He'd been in the business for 21 years. And he's finally now getting to the world title. And he was as good as he could be. But here's the deal. Nick says, Vern told me, you buy a home here, you're part of the promotion, you're part of the company, you're us. And Nick says, I looked at him and I said, Vern, I understand the situation. You own the company. I am your employee. And anytime you tell me something that I'm not happy with, we part ways. And Vern and Nick always had a good working relationship. And Nick told me, he said, I never took the title seriously. He says I was getting good money. I will point out, now this came from Nick, and you put this into 1970s dollars versus today's, okay? Nick says, I'm making $250,000 a year as the champion in 1976, 77. And I'm wrestling on average 6 months a year. again, that AWA territory. Now, when I say he wrestled 6 months a year, he wrestled all year long, but he had time off. You could have a week off here or only work 3 days this week. His schedule was such that when you figured out the whole 52-week year, he worked half of it. And Nick says that I'm making $250,000 a year. And he says, if Vern comes to me tonight and says, I want you to drop the title. And the reason we had that conversation was because you guys will remember the infamous night that Vern Gagne told Stan Hansen in Denver that he wanted Hansen to drop the title that night to Nick. That was the first time he brought it up to Hansen. Hansen said, go to hell, there's no way. I'm not doing it. And he left the building with the belt, by the way. But what I bring this back to Nick as, Nick says he was the boss. What he wanted, I did. And I did it happily. And when I wasn't happy, I would move on. Vern and Nick got along great with that type of relationship.
And just to give context for that 76, 77 era money, and I just sent it to the guys here, that would be about 1.36 and some change $1 million a year in today's money.
Yeah. Well, and let me point this out, Jonathan. Nick also put the comparison together when I was doing an interview with him on my deck. He said that Fritz von Erich had approached him to possibly be the NWA champion when Fritz was president of the NWA, Jack Atkinson. And he said, I looked at Jack, he says, I took pen to paper and I figured out what Harley Race was making a year. He said Harley was making the same money I was, and Harley was wrestling, and this is Nick's comment. He says, Harley's wrestling 368 days a year, and there's only 365 days in a year. But he said Harley never has a day off, and he's all over the country. He's in Australia. He flies up to Montreal. Then he's in California. Then he's out and he says Harley's living in a suitcase. So he said, why would I leave the AWA to become NWA champion?
And not just the champion. In the territory days, in most territories, guys worked 6 to 7 days a week. Right. And when I say 6 to 7 days a week, it's actually 8 matches usually a week, because they would do double shots on Saturdays, double shots on Sundays, sometimes double shots on Friday.
And maybe TV.
And the AWA typically ran 18 days a month. So,
and the AWA also had a lesser schedule from the middle of June through about the middle to the last week of August, because during the summer months, attendance was never at its best, because people in Minnesota, which I'm hoping happens soon, we want to get outside when it's 85 degrees. We don't want to be cooped up in some auditorium. And, all winter long when it's 20 below and the snow's piling up, you go to the arena to see wrestling. That's the way it was back in those days.
See, I'm with you. I'm a Buffalonian, as you know, and here in Buffalo, New York, we're okay with it being cold right now because the Sabres are in the playoffs for the first time in 14 years. Thank you very much. But, we're the same way. Summertime, it's outdoor concerts, and that's about it. Everything else, it dies. But the AWA had the luxury of working mostly big towns, 18 days a month on average, not 28 to 31 days a month like all the other territories, working spot shows in small towns. They could make the money because they were on bigger cards in bigger towns, working less days. And that was the brilliance of the way Vern ran his business.
And look at the Florida territory, for example. Back in the 60s and 70s, and you talk about that 6-7 nights a week working. You looked at, and I don't have them exactly memorized, but I know that Tuesday nights they'd be in Tampa. Monday nights they might be in Miami. Then they'd have a Fort Lauderdale card. Then they'd have a Tallahassee card. And then they'd have Miami Beach. And then there were a couple of other cities. And before you know it, you've worked Sunday through Saturday And like I said, you throw in a TV taping date in there, and sometimes there were cards that, like you said, Brian, where they do a Sunday afternoon matinee, have to travel to the next city to go to the nighttime card.
I wish I had it with me. I don't have a copy of my book with me, but one of the things that's in there, if you remember, well, I know you remember because we talked about it once, but for folks out there who might not have it, the Wrestlers, Masters of the Craft of Professional Wrestling, available on Amazon and all fine booksellers. There's a section where I had Bob Roop break down 1 week in the Amarillo territory, where every night where they were and the distance he was driving and the amount. And I think it ended up being 7 shows that week with like 3,000. There it is. Like 3,000 miles on the car, 7 shows that week. And it's insane the schedule that these guys worked. And that was every territory except New York and Minnesota. And it's really fascinating to read that because Roop will break down. So I'm in here and, we finish the matches at around 10:30. Then I drive overnight to get to the next place, check into a hotel at 6 in the morning. It's just the whole thing and how long, and it's nonstop. And that's what these guys went through.
Well, and what's interesting too is the guys, they had the luxury in that era to, if they didn't like the push they were getting in whatever territory they were working, if they weren't satisfied with their payouts, if they weren't happy with, whatever it was, they had the right to either negotiate it with the promotion, the promoter, the owner, whoever it was, or they could move on. I'm going to point something out. Bob Roop, and I think you just mentioned his name, didn't you?
Yep, it's him in the book.
Okay,
Telling the
Bob Roop told me. I was talking to him years ago, and I asked him, I said, Bob, why didn't you ever come to the AWA? I said, you had all the credentials. You're an amateur. You fit Vern's criteria. You could work as a baby or you could work as a heel if whatever the case was. You know what he told me? He said, I was contacted by Vern more than once. And he said, I would have loved to work the territory, but I don't like the winters. He said, I grew up in Michigan where the winters sucked. And he said, I prefer to be down in the warmer climates, the Atlantic coast or Florida, where he spent a lot of his time. He said, because I didn't like the winters. He said, for me, that was the trade-off. And if I went to work for Vern, I'd have been up there wrestling between October and May in the snowstorms. So Bob had his own personal agenda, and he would have been great here. I'm going to touch on one more thing about gimmicks. You and I, poor Jonathan, he's listening here. We talked about Terry Taylor, the Red Rooster.
Yep.
And I want to say this. I've heard more than one person over the last 40 years say that Vince Jr. ruined Adrian Adonis when he turned him into adorable Adrian Adonis. And you will remember the guy ballooned up. He was up to about 450 pounds. And he went and played the feminine character, the blonde hair, etc. And people say that Vince ruined him. He ruined him. And I look at these people and I say, explain what he did by ruining him. Adrian was paid well to do what he did, how he wrestled and how he went into this character. And here is the bottom line. If Adrian had a problem with portraying that character, he didn't have to do it. He could have moved on.
And I'll tell
End
you
of
right
story.
now,
End of story.
He might have, quote unquote, humiliated him, which maybe it was at first, but Adrian got the doll out of that character, where they all made a ton of money off those dolls. He got the Piper's Pit segment. They gave him the flower shop, so he got that segment too. Adrian's from Kenmore, New York, the little village just north of Buffalo that I live in, is where Adrian was from. But now I'm sure it's not the character he wanted more than anything, but you know what? He knew what to do with it, and he did it.
But and I totally agree with you. I would say that, on the surface, it appeared that he humiliated himself because he was a good worker. He was a good
He was
technical
a
wrestler.
great technical wrestler.
When he was teamed with Jesse Ventura, um, Adrian was the bump taker. Adrian was the one that could do the technical wrestling. Jesse was the showman, the strutter, and the big mouth. And they made a perfect combination. But Adrian went from that biker bad guy type persona. He was with Dick Murdoch for a while in the WWF. And, he went from that character to a complete 180 degrees to, like we said, this overweight, out of shape, bulbous, goofy, feminine character. If he didn't like it, if it really offended him, he had the option to say no. He took the money. So in the end, and I mean, Adrian, to his credit, he left us way too early, but certainly it wasn't through any drugs or anything. It was in the auto accident in July of '88 that took his life, along with the Bear Man, McKigney, and one of the Kelly twins, Mike and Pat Kelly. I always forget which one it was. I think it was Mike in the accident. But that was a car accident that took his life. Certainly wasn't anything he had done to himself maliciously in wrestling. But Vince McMahon did not ruin him. And I'm not a Vince McMahon fan by any stretch. But I will say that he was the boss. This is what I want you to do. And I always told this again, and I'm sure you could relate to this, both of you. In your jobs, your employers, your bosses, they ask you to do a job. They tell you what your position is. If you totally disagree with it, you can move on. But unless they ask me to do something illegal, they're paying me, I'll do it. That's the way I was at the bank.
Yeah, you know what I mean, you're working for them.
Right.
I want to wrap that. I know Jonathan's getting the high sign for time because we've been going like a while, because that's how we are when we talk. Yeah. I'm going to make one more point, and then I'm going to suggest round 5, because I have a discussion I want to have with George that I think should be on the show that would be an hour and a half in and of itself, the one topic.
Oh, man, but what is that?
I'll get to that after this point. Was that, speaking of people who knew the difference between the character and the real life and could separate the gimmicks and knew what it meant to be an employee of someone, was the great Jim Raschke from Nebraska, who the great Baron von Raschke was and you know him.
I do know him. I know him personally. I've been to his house. Yep. He's been to mine.
I know him a little bit, obviously not as well as you do, but is there a more gentle, soft-spoken man that you've ever met than Jim Raschke?
Just a very quiet man, that loud, boisterous, that's all the people need to know. That character, the Claw, he is a very kind, very quiet, very reserved person. And you talk about a guy who could walk away from his character, and you could have a conversation with him. He's actually very funny. You can have a conversation with Jim Raschke. You're moving along, and then you can say something, and he'll go right into the character. And but he's never been Baron von Raschke outside the ring. He's always been Jim Raschke. People call him Baron, but that's just a respect thing, but he's a sweetheart
and a great employee who never personally got along that well with Vern.
Right. And Vern started him in the business.
I respect Vern. Vern's my boss. Vern tells me what to do, and I do it. I don't have him over to my house. I don't go to his house. We don't have dinner together. We're not friends. He's the boss. I'm the employee. And that's, I think a lot of people don't, because it's entertainment. It's the entertainment business. People seem to assume that it's not like any other job when it is. This is what you do for a living. This is your job. You have a boss. Whether you're an athlete or a wrestler or a musician or working in a bank or working in insurance like me, you are an employee with a boss. And Jim Rashkin knows that and knew that and respected it. He didn't have to like the boss. And I think that's what a lot of people don't get in the business. Now, before we wrap up, Jonathan, you wanted to say something?
Well, because of knowing who the boss is and all that stuff, I'm just curious to know if you guys know the son of a bitch who runs this thing. Could you tell him to please fire me?
You've done a great job tonight.
Thank you. I try.
Can I give you an example of a wrestler not liking something and leaving because of it?
Please do.
When Johnny Powers worked for Vern Gagne in 1967, Johnny Powers was given a mega push as a heel. He used what he called the power lock for his finishing hold. And really what it was is it was a figure 4 leg lock. Okay. Johnny bragged about that's how he finished his matches with the power lock. He was arrogant on his interviews. He was given main events. He was in tag team bouts, teamed with Johnny Valentine. He hooked up with Hennig and Race. He wrestled against the Crusher and other top babies. He had a title shot with Vern. He had the Crusher in a cage match, and he holds the distinction of being the only wrestler that got a victory over the Crusher in AWA cage matches ever.
Wow.
So Johnny got a push. But here's what happened. Johnny had been here for about a year, a little over a year, winning matches with his power lock. Well, around August of 1967, here comes Dr. X. The Destroyer, Dick Beyer. New identity, folks.
Buffalo's own.
And Dick Beyer, as Dr. X, his finishing hold was the figure 4 leg lock. Vern actually went to Johnny Powers, and he said, I'm sure he said with Dick being here now and in the territory, he's going to use the figure 4. And Vern had this thing about 2 wrestlers couldn't use the same hold. He didn't usually like 2 masked wrestlers or 2 blonde wrestlers. He liked everybody to have their own persona, okay? He told Johnny that I don't want you to use going forward the power lock. We'll just go over that and you'll win without it. Powers took exception to it. He said, no, that's what we've been doing for the last year. This is I brag about my power lock, etc. And Vern says, well, I don't want you to use it anymore. We're going to give it to Dr. X. And Powers left.
Wow.
He told Vern, okay, I'm done. Now, did it hurt Johnny Powers? No, because he went and he started the what was it, the IWA at the time?
Mm-hmm.
The promotion. He was involved in that promotion. He became a champion in Japan. He had his own promotion. Johnny Powers did fine. But that was an example right there of he didn't like what the boss was telling him. That's his prerogative. He either does what the boss says or his choice was to move on, and he did. I respect the man immensely for that.
Absolutely. Then again, it's weird today. I don't think we can afford the same things to guys today because there's nowhere for them to go.
There you go. That's where the business is destroyed.
Yep. And that's what's wrong with the business. Now, I know we got to wrap up because we've been going, almost 2 hours.
At least. Yeah.
A little over an hour and a half. But for round 5, this is the discussion. Now, we won't go into it at all now.
A rematch.
We're not going to go into it now at all, as much as we're both going to want to. And as soon as I say it, your face is going to break into a big smile. But we're going to save this for the next one. I think we can all agree that one of the greatest workers in the modern era of wrestling is Nick Bockwinkel. And modern era, I say anything from 1960 to 84. Do you, as the historian who saw it, think Bockwinkel was better as a tag team with Ray Stevens or as a solo as the champ?
Are we answering that now or
No,
saving
that's
us?
what the next show is going to be, because you can make an argument they're one of the greatest tag teams ever, and you can also make an argument he's one of the greatest champions ever. Where was he at his best?
Jonathan?
I will close. Look, go ahead. Sorry.
I want to thank you for giving Brian and I this chance to what a great conversation. We just flow back and forth. Honest to God. If there's somebody that listens to this that can't find excitement in it, well, then they're just not a fan. You know,
exactly.
And there's not a note here, folks. I had a notepad that I brought out. I always specify this. I don't have notepads. I don't have notes. We just talk. Man, I love it.
Me too.
I'm going to quote the great Gene LaBelle for the line that he always said to my friend Anthony DeLongis when Anthony was inducted into the Black Belt Hall of Fame. And it's become a thing with me and Anthony. I would, because of the story, and I'm not going to bore people with the story. If you want to know the story, shoot me a message. But as far as someone who's always studied history and hoped to reach your levels, and Brian and George, you guys are my hero.
Thank you so much.
I'm humbled, believe me. Thank you. I want to share this since you brought up Gene LaBelle. A little trivia for both of you, and maybe Brian, you do know this. Maybe you do too, Jonathan. But a little trivia about Gene LaBelle, Judo Gene LaBelle. He was a real deal guy. Let's not take that away from him. Did either of you guys know that for a short time back in the late 40s and very early 50s that he actually dated Noel Neal, who was Lois Lane in the Superman television program?
No, I had no idea.
Me neither.
There you go.
And that's pre her as Lois Lane. That's back when she was part of this is where the historian of being even a film nerd comes in. There was a series of movies called The Teenagers, and they did like the teenagers on campus, the teenagers go to college, and she was always in those. She was in that film series too, before she was Lois Lane.
Neil was in the late 40s Superman serials that starred Kirk Allen as Superman. And then the first season of The Adventures of Superman on TV with George Reeves, you will remember that Phyllis Coates was playing Lois Lane. And I don't remember what the deal was that Neil wasn't available for some reason. I could look back on my notes. I'm a huge old comic fan too, so but Gene LaBelle and I were talking one time at Waterloo, the museum. In fact, I take that back. It was still in Newton, Iowa, when he and I talked. And he gave me a book that he had put out, and he and I were talking, and in the book he talks about it, and he also showed me a picture of him and I think it's Noel or Noel Neal, but they actually dated. So there you go, sports fans.
That is amazing.
I can't think of a better way to end on that.
I gotta say, George, I love doing these conversations more than you can ever imagine. This is like, it's a term that the young kids use nowadays that I feel weird saying as an old man, but this is nerd porn for me. This is what I enjoy. These conversations, this kind of talk. And I can't thank you enough, and Jonathan, just for hosting it and getting us together to do this. You're the man. You are the man.
Let me point this out. When you say that it's like, what'd you call it? Something porn? What was it?
Nerd porn.
Nerd porn. Um, you obviously can tell that I could talk wrestling all night long. And it's kind of ironic. I had mentioned Vern Gagne's passing being today, but in 2 days, on the 29th, I'm going to be retired from my banking job for 18 years.
Oh,
And I'm serious when I tell you this. There's not one day since that time I left work on April 29th of 2008 that I have not worked on something wrestling, be it research. It could be podcasts, it could be radio programs, it could be doing presentations. I do it all the time, and I am living the life I am so happy to live with my wrestling collection around me and being able to share history. And I wouldn't go back and change it for anything. And when I get to do what I just did with you, Brian and Jonathan, God bless you, my friend, for putting those headphones on and listening to us two birds for 2 hours. You need that whiskey when you get done, okay?
And I would, but I'm Poe right now. And normally George can, well, both of you can testify to this in these conversations. I enjoy sitting back, learning something as a history guy, but also sipping on a good whiskey, just learning something for once. Dang nabbit.
This coming weekend is the Kentucky Derby, so you better get some Kentucky bourbon in you, boy. No whiskey now, Kentucky bourbon.
Well, you're gonna.
If anybody wants my PayPal or Venmo, so I can do that, feel free. No.
You're gonna let us know when this airs so that we can take a look at it. And I'm ready for a rematch. Let me know the date and time, and I'll sign the contract.
And
let's do it sometime in May.
All right.
Sounds good.
Very good. Gentlemen, thank you so much.
Bless you, sir. Brian, always great, my friend.
Always a pleasure, my friend. Have a great night.
You are going to need a bigger closet when you meet our new friends.
What?
Our friends over at Silk Screams out of Buffalo, New York is a diverse owned company that has a variety of shirts to fit your needs.
I need your clothes, your boots, and your motorcycle.
Let's also not forget that Silk Screams also runs the semi-annual Buffalo Horror Garage Sale, which has tons of merchandise, celebrity guests, and tons of fun. Check our friends out over on their Big Cartel site to order stuff, or on social media for updates on merch, or on the Buffalo Horror Garage Sale. Visit our friends, like I said, at Silk Screams today.
Yeah, baby.
This is Eric Redbeard, and I've been listening to Crazy Train Radio.